In our last video, we were looking at the Mueller company, the Mueller family, and got into the point where we crossed the river from Sarnia. We started Mueller company here in Port Huron, and that's what we want to look at today. As you can see from this aerial photograph, that Mueller Brass was a pretty large complex. That's not originally what it looked like. When Oscar Mueller came over here and started the Mueller company, it wasn't called Mueller Brass then. It wasn't called Mueller Brass until 1924. It was called Mueller Metals, and this is what it looked like. You can see in this photograph, Lapeer Avenue isn't even paved. And Mueller Brass, certainly at the early years, wasn't at all in the proportions that we remember it when we were growing up. Not the huge complex. It was big, but many of their buildings, you can't really see them here, but they're sitting in there behind. Many of the buildings were wooden at that time. As you can see in this photograph here of this tractor being driven through Mueller's, and on the right there, you can see the wooden building, quite a large one it would appear. And here's another one, and as we zoom in here, you can see the wood siding on it. Many of these photographs you'll see here in this video were obtained by going through the archives of the Mueller Museum. This is the exterior of the number 1 brass forging building, and this is the inside of that building. I would think that having a forging building made of wood would be a fire hazard, but so many of the buildings in Port Huron were made of wood back then. And this building here, also wood, is number 2 brass forging building. We'll zoom in here and take a little closer look. This is inside that same building, and here you can see the lathes that they used. These are actually called facing lathes. Here's a photo of foundry number 4. And here's the inside of foundry number 4. I know that many of the fellows that worked at Mueller Brass over the years don't recognize some of these photographs because they're going back to 1917, 1918, right in there. But I thought you might be interested to see what it looked like back then. And here's another picture of the inside. In this photo you see the slag crusher building, and of course you can also see the water tower in the background. And here's the inside of that building. And here we have foundry number 3. Now up front we have a little different mode of transportation than what we're used to. Now this looks more like the buildings that I remember. This is foundry number 1, and this is the inside of foundry number 1. And this is the core room in the same foundry. And here we have the government inspection and stamping building. And this is looking at the inside. And here we're looking at the ovens. And in this photograph we see a new foundry being built, and more in the lines of the buildings that I remember. And in the nickel plating department we see a bunch of fellows posing for us. Here we see the shrapnel shell shop, and in the next photograph here we see the shell inspection shop. In this photograph here we see the inside of the tube mill. In these next 3 photographs we'll see the inside of the rod mill. I thought this photograph was interesting because of all the women that are working here during that time period. I thought that was kind of unusual, actually. This was actually in the inside of the brass finishing shop. I told you in our last video the main reason for building the Port Huron plant is because the United States entered into World War I, and they already had a munition contract with Canada, and were hoping to get one with the United States as well, which they did. There's a story connected to this that involves Oscar's brother Adolf, along with his other brothers, and their vision for what they had for something called Muellerville, which was a city that they would create, with the plant being in the center part of it, and houses were to be built all around it for the employees. The plan was that the employee, after he had saved enough for a 10% down payment on one of the attractive homes, he could move his family in and pay off the rest on easy terms. And they would build stores and everything else the city would need. So things were looking good for the Mueller Company. They had a large contract with the Canadian government. They had 2 plants now, looking forward to a contract with the United States government. And everything was all right until they actually entered the war. Once they entered the war, the bottom fell out. The Canadian government canceled the contract with Mueller Company to make World War I munitions at the firm's Port Huron plant. The contract was dropped as soon as it was evident the United States was going to enter the war. Apparently, the Canadians thought that their rich ally to the south could supply the needed munitions. Voiding the contract left the Mueller's Port Huron plant with several $100,000 worth of munitions equipment and more than $1 million in raw materials on hand. To recover from this, it was recognized would take more than had been planned for development of the employed village, Muellerville. The Muellerville vision was not to be. Did you notice how I was showing you historical pictures with captions while I was telling you that story? I thought you might need a visual to keep you from falling asleep. Muellers continued to make munitions for World War I, and then when World War II broke out, they made some very important contributions to the war effort. In an article that Frank Mueller wrote about Mueller's contribution toward the war effort, he said this: Mueller's got his first war contract, at least of World War II, in 1941. It started with making 37 and later 57 millimeter projectiles. Still later, the 155 millimeter high explosive shells were made. It was on a special 57 millimeter projectile that the company helped the Army in a crisis that contributed to the shaping of world history. The German General George Rommel, with a heavy tank force, was moving rapidly in North Africa, threatening to invade Egypt and jeopardize the Allied Army sources of oil in the Arabian Peninsula area. The Germans had developed a phase-hardened tank armor that made the conventional 57 millimeter projectile ineffective. Mueller's was asked to produce a projectile that would penetrate phase-hardened armor plate and reach the inside of the tank intact. Its spinning around inside would be fatal to the tank's personnel. Mueller's engineers came up with a process that would make the projectile consistently perform as required, and the first batch of the new projectiles were flown to North Africa. There they were effective in slowing down Rommel's army in the Battle of Kasserine Pass and other engagements. This performance was recognized by the government in 1943 by awarding Mueller's an Army and Navy E-flag, which was presented to the board chairman Adolf Mueller. This was the highest award a defense contractor could get. Mueller employees did their part too to contribute to the war effort. They did this by buying war bonds. Corporations during the wartime took buying war bonds, at least from their employees, very seriously, as you can tell from this photograph here and also the next one. I found this in the Times Herald of the Mueller employees during a bond drive, and you can see from the sign, you can't read it too clear, but I'll tell you what it says. Every bond that now is sold gives the eagle a stranglehold. I'm sure that's referring to our national bird, the eagle. In In 1910, Mueller's started to put out a magazine called the Mueller's Record, and you can see the cover of this one here, boasting a little bit about their award. In this cover here, you can see that they're celebrating the anniversary of the birthday, the 100th birthday of Hieronymus Mueller, and the 75th anniversary of the founding of the Mueller Company. And in this cover here, they're looking back 50 years at that point anyway of America's first race that we looked at in our last video. The Mueller Record was a magazine that was put out by the Mueller Company for their employees to keep them up to date with what was going on, not only in their own plant, which was the main plant was in Decatur originally, and then of course in the other plants as they were added to it. And almost anything could go in these newspapers, no matter how insignificant. Quite often, as men went off to war during the war years, it would be noted in the newspaper. Here we can see one ex-Mueller employee that was in the Navy and now in France. And on this page here, we can see that they were being kept up to date with the Liberty bonds that were being purchased by the employees. Sporting events were also a big thing, and quite often there'd be pictures taken and put in the paper as well, as you can see here from the softball team. And in this page here, we can see some of the girls of Mueller employees swimming at the YWCA. And sometimes there was little personal stories about some of the employees. If you want to call Oscar Mueller an employee, this one's about him, and I'll let you read it at your leisure. And it continues on the next page. They would list the news from the Port Huron and Sarnia plants separately. Here you can see the Port Huron news. Not really sure this classifies as news, but look what it says here. Wheels are wheeling, presses are pressing, forges are forging, Kip is skipping around like a Mexican jumping bean, and everybody is moving faster than ever, if that's possible. I especially like this newsy article. The Port Huron restroom is one that no one could but envy. It is nearly completed and will have a grand opening in a few days. A more handsome or substantial structure was never devoted to a like cause. Stage, balcony, dance floor, reading rooms, and everything. Stucco outside, and oh, so swellow inside. Yes, they did write a little differently back then. But just think, you got to see this restroom. And sometimes it would put out special issues, such as this one here, the minstrel number. Most of the people that participated in this were actually executives in the company. Several of the Mueller brothers are in that picture as well. You can't see very well here, but let me take it on a separate page and blow it up a little bit. Somehow I just don't think that this would be politically correct today. But back then it was all in good fun. In 1941, Mueller Brass decided to have their own newspaper to keep up on the news, probably because of the war. They had a lot of employees working then, and everyone could see what was happening in the plant, more so than just a small excerpt put into the company magazine, The Record. And in this first edition, you can see they haven't even named it yet. What shall we name it? This newspaper also gave the Mueller employees that were parents to give the opportunity to show off their kids, especially if they were just born or quite small. And you can see one here, and then in this next slide you can see that it shows not only the birth but also the death, and in this case was Oscar Mueller, which really didn't have a very big write-up at all. One paragraph for the man that started the Mueller Brass Company. But we'll look more into his death in our next video. Well, here's a cute kid. I had to put this on. It was in the Mueller Brass paper. And my parents weren't immune. They had to show off their kid too. And that little kid is me at 22 months. Wow, what a handsome little devil. Join me in our next video and we'll wrap up the Mueller brass story and go on and see what else there is to see.